Let's scroll down the visual real quick. And the first part we have is ordinary and necessary. We have to make sure that the client understands that their expenses that they're trying to deduct is considered ordinary and necessary for business purposes. So it's important to know it's ordinary and necessary. So let's go through each individual word itself. Where the client says ordinary, it's an expense. An expense is ordinary if it is common or accepted in a taxpayer's industry or type of business. And it's not extraordinary or extraordinary. And the expense shouldn't be unusual or unique to the taxpayer's specific situation. So an example of ordinary is, let's just say that you have a client that is a plumber and he has to hire help on certain projects, right? So when he hires help, he could find someone that's in the plumbing industry that he doesn't really know, but he knows their work. So he hires them for, say, $400 for a particular job. And that's the going rate of how much he could pay any plumber that he were to find or any assistant that he could find for that project. But let's say that he actually hired his cousin for the same type of job, but for his cousin who's doing the same job, he's paying him $2,000 because that's his cousin, he wants to help his cousin out. But that $2,000 is overpaying for the certain job that he's doing. So that's where it's not considered ordinary anymore, because he could hire the same person for a lot cheaper. And the only reason why he's paying his cousin a higher rate is because that's his cousin, not necessarily for the job itself. So it's not industry specific for the job itself. Now let's talk about necessary. An expense is necessary if it is helpful or useful in furthering the taxpayer's business or income producing activity. It doesn't have to be essential, but should contribute to the business success. So this is where we have to really explain to clients that, hey, is it necessary? Because clients tend to think that everything is a necessary business expense. For example, if a client paid for a trip somewhere, they're gonna say that's a necessary business expense because maybe they met with an old college roommate that might be in the same business, but the thing is, was it really necessary for the person to fly out all the way there to meet an old college friend? Or could the same conversation could have been done over a phone call or a Zoom? So making sure client understands that ordinary and necessary is just part of the definition with IRS or IRC 162A. Now, let's talk about some add-ons that I like to put on there as well to ensure that every single deduction that the client has for business is a proper deduction. And the first thing I want to talk about is reasonable and appropriate. So this is kind of similar to ordinary and necessary. So the expense should be reasonable in an amount and appropriate for the business needs. So this is kind of similar to the plumber story I just said, where is it reasonable for the plumber to hire their cousin and pay them more than 4 times the regular amount that they would pay someone else to do the same job? And we have to make sure that there is a business purpose. The expense must have a clear business purpose and not be primarily for personal benefit, and it's not excessive. So looking at the example that I have right here, paying for a $500 flight for business travel is reasonable, but paying for a $5,000 cruise ship for business travel is excessive, because it's way cheaper to buy a plane to get to the same place, and it's more efficient to take a plane than to take a cruise ship that's going to take a lot longer. And really it's for the primary personal use of the person who just pretty much wants to relax while on a cruise. And also with this cruise ship, it's considered excessive, $5,000 versus $500. And $500 is way more efficient when it comes to time because you get there faster compared to the ship itself. So when we're looking at this example right here, the boat right here is clearly going to be more for personal benefit, and also it's going to be excessive, while the plane is going to be more for business purposes because it's faster to get to whatever destination that they need to get to, and the cost is reasonable. The next thing I want to talk about is paid and put to use. So the first thing is that the item must be paid for in the current year or put on a credit card or have some kind of contract showing that there is an intent to pay for it, as long as they took ownership of it and they paid for the item in some kind of way. And then the second one is the item must be put to business use in the current year as well. So a common thing, actually an audit that I had for a client where he is a optometrician or ophthalmologist, and he buys equipment for taking care of people's eyes. So he actually bought an equipment in November, December of the tax year. We deducted it in November, December, but he actually had it in storage because he wasn't ready to use it yet. So when the auditor actually audited his tax return, they asked, okay, where's the receipt for buying this equipment, and he showed that he bought it in November or December of that year. But then when the auditor actually asked my client directly, okay, where's the machine right now, or when did you put it to use, my client actually still had it in storage, and he actually never really put it into use from what I can remember. And then the auditor actually said that they disallowed that expense, which was a big expense. It was like $8,000 because the client didn't put the item to use yet. Next thing I want to talk about is not personal in nature. And what this means is that this can't be for personal use. And an example here, a common example that you're going to see with clients is that, okay, they eat out with their professional colleagues, co-workers, or maybe even business partners. And they talk about business. They talk about how the business is going, what they could do to make it better, asking for advice. And that is a business meeting that they're having over lunch. So the lunch is going to be deductible. However, if a person is working alone and eating while working, that is not a business deduction, because the IRS is going to consider that's personal use, because you're eating anyways, like you have to eat as a human being. So because of that, even though you're working at the same time, it doesn't count as a business expense, because eating alone by itself is kind of personal in nature. So let's go over this whole overview real quick of ordinary and necessary, and then we also want to make sure that it's reasonable and appropriate, it's paid and put to use, and it's not personal in nature. So as a tax advisor, remember to be able to explain all of these to clients very clearly so they understand what is a reasonable and deductible business expense. Now let's